All right, welcome to today's MSP Success Experts Corner webinar. I see everybody piling on in here. My name is Allison Felber. I'm the editor-in-chief at MSP Success. We are the ones bringing you this webinar today, bringing you the man in pink, Dave Rendell. Him and I were talking, right before this came on, and he was like, hey, I was talking to someone over at your organization and they were giving me registration numbers and I thought they were pulling my leg because you guys had so many people registered for this. And I was like, yeah, they were pulling your leg. That's not true. It's double. We sent one more email today and we got double the amount. Dave's a little nervous now, if you can't tell. No, I'm just kidding. He is a speaking expert. That's what he's going to talk to you about today, is how to put together a presentation that you can use in order to sell, in order to present yourself as an expert. I know a lot of people terrified of public speaking. They're having nightmares about public speaking. It's like the worst thing on earth that you could ask them to do. And so Dave's here to give some tips and ways that you can be a better speaker, because when you are a speaker, when you present, it elevates you as the expert. And we all know that, it's getting harder and harder to, find good, prospects and good clients. And so when you can elevate yourself as an expert, a go-to authority, in your market, then you're going to get those leads coming to you because everybody wants to work with the expert. And so getting on stage, presenting, whether it's a webinar like we're doing today, or on stage in front of thousands, in front of 10 people, you are, as soon as you walk on stage, as soon as you start that webinar, you are an expert. And so Dave's going to talk to you about how to put that presentation together. If you've been, to some of the events in the IT industry, you probably recognize, Dave Rendell. He's been on the MC at boot camp, at TMT's annual boot camp and road shows, kind of a staple, at a lot of TMT events. And so we're excited to have him here as a speaker. How many views did your TED Talk have, Dave?
My one from Zurich has like 85,000 or something like that. Just on the TED website. It's also on YouTube and it has views there, but yeah.
Yeah, so you can tout that amazing TED Talk that he has, a former professor as well, stand-up comedian, so you'll laugh a couple times, at his bad dad jokes. They're coming, I promise. And, I think, we've even been on stage together, you and I, Dave, both dressed to the nines in our gala dresses. I kid you not, Dave, full-on dress on stage. So maybe I'll find that picture while you're presenting and we'll embarrass you at the end. So,
I think at some of the first events, wasn't it Cardboard Allison, or was it never Cardboard Allison? Was it some other cardboard person?
That was Cardboard Hannah.
It was never Cardboard Allison. Okay.
No, I brought Cardboard Hannah.
That's what it was. You were always delivering her to me.
Yeah, I was. So, okay. Well, you've got a lot to cover today. I know that you said, you're going to cram things in, get this in an hour. An amazing trainer from the amazing Dave Rendell. Thank you for being here, and I'll let you take it away.
All right. Step one, never accept a presentation the week of July 4th. People are focused on the holidays and nobody wants to listen to your stupid speech. Step two, stand up, right? So if you're doing a virtual presentation, absolutely stand up. You'll see me doing this, and that's another thing I want you to focus on during this presentation is I'm going to be doing what I want you to do. So don't just listen to what I'm saying, watch what I'm doing. And it's a big hassle in most settings to find a way to stand up. I've used tables in conference rooms at hotels and stacked benches and chairs and all sorts of things. But standing up is going to have a huge impact on your virtual presentations. It looks different. It's going to feel different to you. Your body's going to work different. Your voice is going to work different. So step one, just bonus tip, is stand up. Obviously, tip number 3 is to wear pink. That's going to get you the focus that you need, the attention that you need. So that's definitely the thing to do. So let's get started. And that's another tip, by the way. You're always started. I hate it when people get on stage and say, before we start, I just want to say a few things. As soon as you appear, you are on stage. Things have started. Things are happening. So let's go ahead and get into it. I've got a PowerPoint here. So you're going to see less of me, which is going to be super disappointing. The main idea for today, and one of the main ideas, the main idea that I'm going to teach you, is you have to have a main idea. You get one idea. I've done a 2-day training on this one idea: persuasive speakers tell powerful stories that reinforce a single idea. So for the next hour, the only thing we're talking about is that persuasive speakers tell powerful stories that reinforce a single idea. Don't tell me you need to have 2 ideas. Don't tell me you have 3. Don't tell me you have a lot to cover. Have one clear thing that you want people to understand or that you want them to do, and stay focused on that one thing the entire time. That's the most important thing you can do. If that's all you do differently, and for 1 hour you stay focused on one thing, people are going to get way more from your presentation than they normally would. So persuasive speakers tell powerful stories that reinforce a single idea. And so again, watch what I do, not just what I say. So I'm going to start with a story about someone telling stories. So I was attending or speaking at an event for a company that makes drones. They made commercial drones, they made recreational drones for individuals, but they also made drones for the military. And is so serious that when the CEO was putting on his microphone, he didn't like the microphone. And I said, well, I'll let him use my microphone. And they said, you can't use his microphone because his microphone is encrypted. They wanted to make sure no one could listen in on what he was saying to his employees at this event. That's how serious it was. But he was about to get up there and talk about Q4 results and talk about profit and loss and do all of these things that were going to be honest, relatively boring. And the way he made it work was he started with a story. And his story was this: that one of their drones was being flown by a drone operator for the US military in Iraq, and there was a convoy, and the drone was doing reconnaissance and overwatch for that convoy as they were traveling through the desert. And as that drone operator was doing reconnaissance, he noticed there was a pickup truck coming towards the convoy in the opposite direction at a high rate of speed. And this alarmed him, and he was concerned about this. And so he said the code word that you say to the people on the ground so that they know that there's danger. And then all the drone operator saw after that was just everything went blank, everything went black, everything literally went up in smoke. And after a few minutes of total chaos, the people on the ground reported back to the drone operator, and they said, everyone is present and accounted for. Thank you for saving our lives. Now, when that story's over, I'm just there as a speaker. I'm ready to solder some stuff. I'm ready to weld some stuff. I'm ready to make a drone. And I don't even work for that company. I'm ready to work in accounts payable because I want to be a person who saves the life of United States military members. Great message, by the way, for July 4th. I want to be a person who saves the lives of military members by making these amazing drones. Doing my job saves people's lives in Iraq. And if you can't say that or you don't believe that, the rest of this CEO's presentation is super boring and super lame and super uninteresting. So persuasive speakers tell powerful stories. And then I just told you a story about a person who told a story. Right? That's how you use stories in a presentation. So when you're starting your presentation, ask yourself, what's a story that I can tell that reinforces this main idea that I have? Persuasive speakers tell powerful stories that reinforce a single idea. So let's start from the end. What's your single idea? Then what's a story that I could tell that would be persuasive? And you think, well, what did he persuade them to do? Well, he persuaded them to work harder because he gave them a reason, he gave them a meaning, he gave them a why that got them focused on what he wanted them to do. Even though the rest of his presentation wasn't going to be super exciting, the mission that they had was super exciting once he told that story and reminded people, and this is important, that stuff was happening, but the day-to-day person doesn't know that unless someone tells them that story. So here's a question that I want you to ask yourself, and that's another one of the things we're going to talk about today is asking questions, right? Asking questions. And so my question for you is, what is it worth? You're in this presentation and you're watching this right before July 4th, so extra credit to you. But as you think about yourself, I want you to ask you a question. What's it worth for you to get better at public speaking? What's it worth for you to get better at presenting? What's it worth for you to get better at webinars? And to answer that question, I think it's helpful to think about what it's been worth to other people. What do you think it's worth Apple, now more than $1 trillion company? What was it worth to them that Steve Jobs was an excellent presenter, not even just an acceptable presenter, and certainly not a terrible presenter? What's it worth? What does it continue to be worth to Apple that Steve Jobs was such an incredible presenter? And the reason I picked him is because you might say, Dave, I'm just working at an IT company. I'm just working at an MSP. I'm just running this thing. It's not that exciting. It's not that sexy. Steve Jobs was in that same situation and he made it sexy. He was even selling hardware. You're selling cybersecurity sometimes. That's super sexy compared to, you want this CPU, right? So his ability to make it interesting, his ability to get people's attention, his ability to change our idea of, can corporate presentations be exciting or interesting? He's turned product releases into something that people anticipate instead of something that they dread. Simon Sinek is another great example of this. He was a speaker, he's a presenter, and then he did a TED Talk, and his TED Talk has more than 56 million views. And if you notice, he wasn't even using technology. He had a whiteboard. He was literally drawing things in whiteboard. And his message was the most basic message you could have. Start with why. Start with purpose. By the way, what did the CEO of the drone company do? They started with purpose. It's one of the most obvious things you can tell people. I have multiple books and multiple presentations: stress management, time management, leadership. Guess what one of the key things in every one is? Purpose. Start with why. I'm going to tell you in this presentation that it's important to start with why. Simon Sinek's message was not revolutionary, but he delivered it in a way and in a situation that 56 million people, and that number is bigger now because it grows every single day. It's one of the most watched TED Talks of all time. What's that worth to him? Simon Sinek gets 6 figures to do a presentation. Simon Sinek runs an organization that delivers presentations online. Simon Sinek, when he writes a book, it's immediately a bestseller. People see Simon Sinek as a thought leader because he shared his idea in a presentation in a way that got people's attention and has created tremendous value. Basically, his business is the fact that 56 million people have watched. That credibility that he gets from that, Allison said at the beginning, is what powers his entire organization. So you might say, well, Dave, I'm not Steve Jobs. But again, Steve Jobs wasn't Steve Jobs before Steve Jobs started giving those amazing presentations. But I've experienced this as well. I did a little presentation for 6 people one time when I was a college professor. And 3 of the people were even all from the same company. So it wasn't even 6 prospects. And I barely had a spot to stand at the edge of a table. I certainly wasn't on a stage. I didn't really have any space to present. I just pushed my chair out that I was sitting in at this conference table and just stood up in front of these people. And some of them were like right next to me. And I gave my presentation to the best of my ability. And one of the 6 people in the room walked up to me and said, I'm the training director at Potash Corp. It's a huge mining company now called Nutrien, that's partially owned by the Canadian government. And she said, we need somebody to do performance evaluation training. Can you help us? And I said, yes. And I did a presentation for them, a half-day presentation for them. And then I started doing some full-day presentations on other topics. And then I started doing some coaching for them. And it's been almost 20 years of working for that one company, millions and millions of dollars in ongoing MRR, right? Not millions per month, right? But you get the idea. MRR during that entire time that's added up to millions of dollars over the course of 20 years because I gave one presentation for free to fill in for a professor that didn't show up. And I could have thought, well, what's this going to matter? This is stupid. I'm not on stage anywhere. There's nobody famous and successful here. There's not a lot of amazing prospects in the room. It only took one, right? It only took one, but that's the power of presentations. At that point, I sort of had a consulting business. My business wasn't really presentations. It was a little bit of a training business, so that helped. But that one presentation is still driving. I just over the last 2 days, I've done 10 coaching calls with people from that company because I did that one presentation. Presentations are a powerful driver of your business success. The same thing happened with another company that I spoke to, Entrepreneurs Organization. They have chapters of entrepreneurs all over the world. I did one presentation one time for free to help out a friend, not for Entrepreneurs Organization, but one of their members was there. They told one of their chapter leaders, they booked me to speak, and now I've done hundreds of presentations for Entrepreneurs Organization all over the world over the course of the last 15 years because my presentation caught people's attention, because I'm a persuasive speaker that tells powerful stories that reinforces a single idea. Now, why do I tell you that? Because this is valuable, and I'm not just telling you that this is valuable. I've experienced the value, and that's why I'm so passionate about this, and that's why I'm willing to do something like this on July 4th week, right? So persuasive speakers tell powerful stories that reinforce a single idea. So you're like, okay, Dave, I know it's valuable, but like Allison started with, I get nervous and I don't want to do this. So let's talk about that, right? The number one fear that people have in life is not death. Death is number two. Public speaking is first, right? Death is the number two fear that people have, and public speaking is the first. Now, I don't know if Sidney Sheldon said that, and that's a good tip, is to make sure you research that kind of stuff. It doesn't matter for this situation. I'm not relying on Sidney Sheldon's authority and credibility. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But the key thing to know is that when you ask people what they're afraid of, death is lower down on the list than presentation. Seinfeld said that since people fear public speaking more than death, it means at any given funeral, people would rather be in the coffin than giving the eulogy. Right? So people have a tremendous amount of anxiety around doing presentations. So what do you do with that anxiety? Right? So one of the things that I was able to do during my career is do a presentation in Bahrain. If you think of Saudi Arabia on the map looking kind of like a big moon boot or maybe an Ugg boot, there's a little island off the edge of the shin of the boot, and it's called Bahrain. It's only about the size of a city. And I got asked to speak over there for a training company, and I did a bunch of work with them over a period of years. And one of the things they asked me to do was to do a presentation and do some speaker evaluations for people who were in this training program. So these ladies had gone through this presentation skills training program, and they asked me to fly over there, give a presentation like I'm doing to you about presentations, and then sit back and give these ladies feedback on their presentations. And so I had all this amazing stuff designed and ready, just like I did today. But I walked into the room and you could feel the tension, you could feel the unhappiness, you could feel the pain that these people were experiencing. And so I closed my laptop, I threw away my presentation, and I asked a question. And one of the things we're going to talk about today is creating modules and including questions. I've already asked you some questions. What's it going to be worth, right? So I just put everything away and asked them a question. I said, how are you feeling? And they said, we're feeling terrible, and we're feeling anxious, and we're going to have panic attacks, and we're going to have heart attacks. And the last thing we want to do in the world is do this presentation. And then I asked them another question. I said, how am I feeling? Right? How am I feeling? And they said, you feel fine. And I said, why do I feel fine? And they said, because you do this all the time. And then I said, okay, I feel fine because I do this all the time. And maybe I misunderstand because I don't live in Bahrain, but this is a room full of women. Are you telling me that you don't talk on a daily basis? Research shows that women use 2 to 3 times as many words as men in any given day. I know you talk. Are you telling me you don't talk? They said, it's not the same. And that was my message to them. And that's my message to you today. It is the same. Giving a presentation should use the same skills and the same experience and the same technique that you use to talk normal on a daily basis. The problem is you shut off this part of you that's been speaking for your entire life and communicating relatively effectively, probably for your entire life in interpersonal situations, and you think you have to become some different kind of person to give a presentation. And that's exactly what makes your presentation not feel good and not go well and causes you to feel anxious, because you're telling yourself, I don't have experience at this, I'm not very good at this, and I don't think I'm going to do this very well. well. But if I ask you to tell me about your weekend, you don't fire up a PowerPoint. You don't start putting together some bullet points. You just start talking to me like a person, and you probably tell me a story about your weekend. And it might even be a funny one. And you're not even that funny, but you didn't start with a joke. You told me a funny story about something that happened to you or somebody you were with on the weekend. You gave me a spontaneous presentation because you weren't trying to do something weird and artificial. You were talking to me like a normal person. And so one of the things I want to do for you today is reframe. The problem is with most people is the way you look at presentations. Public speaking is not fundamentally different from private speaking, right? Speaking on stage should not be fundamentally different from the way you speak in real life. And if you get rid of that idea that you don't know what you're doing and you replace it with the fact that you've been speaking for your entire life, or at least since the age of like 1.5 or 2, you've got a tremendous amount of communications experience, and that starts to change the way you feel about presentations. The next thing you want to do to reduce anxiety is to prepare, because the number one thing people are afraid of is failure. Well, how do you avoid failure? You prepare. Now, preparing is different from practicing, and we're going to talk about that. And by the way, one of the biggest groups that turned things around during the pandemic was doomsday preppers, right? People are making fun of them, watching that show, mostly saying that they're ridiculous and crazy right up until the pandemic in 2020. And man, did those people have a rebrand, a turnaround. People started immediately becoming interested in prepping and immediately became friends with any prepper they knew, because that's where you want to go when the zombie apocalypse happens, is in their bunker, right? So one of the first things to do is to prepare, and preparing happens way before the presentation, right? This isn't practice for a specific presentation. This is preparing to give presentations. And there's a few books that I really, really, really recommend, and that a lot of the stuff in this presentation is based on. So if you want to get better at presentations and feel less anxious, you need to be more prepared. And the way you get prepared is you learn about how to communicate with other people effectively. So one of the best books that I've ever read for that is Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath. One of their 6 key points is to tell stories. And so that's one of the places that I got that. Another great one is called The Psychology of Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion by Robert Cialdini. Fantastic book. I'd really encourage you to check that out. You've probably seen a TED Talk. If not, you've heard people talk about TED Talks. I've already talked about a TED Talk. I've done a few TEDx talks. And so talk like TED. Why? Because people watch TED Talks. So if you can communicate in a way that people are used to listening to, and if you can understand what's made TED Talks so successful, one of the things is they're shorter, but people also tell a lot of stories. And again, they do a lot of the things that I'm going to talk to you about here. That's another great way to learn about it, is what are those people doing that's effective? What did Simon Sinek do that got him 56 million views? Talk Like TED is a fantastic book as well. And along the same lines is TED Talks by Chris Anderson, because obviously he knows, and he's the person to tell you about that. He's the person who started TED and turned it into what we've heard about, or what we know about today. So a little stuck on there. All right, so there's preparation, and then the next thing is practice. I'm gonna take my jacket off here. It's getting a little warm, and plus want you to be able to see the guns. So practice is working on your presentation. Now, here's a mistake I see people make a lot. They say, oh, I'm going to work on it, and then I'm going to give it to my marketing director. I'm going to give it to a graphic designer. I'm going to give it to my assistant, and they're going to do the slides. Here's why that's a mistake. When you're working on your slides, you're working on your presentation. At the very least, sit next to that person and work on the slide design together, because while you're working on the images, you're practicing and starting to understand better what you're going to be talking about. You're also reviewing it and thinking about the best way to visually represent what you're doing. And so designing your slides shouldn't be seen as a waste of time or an extra step. It's actually a form of practice, right? It's actually a form of practice. So Ralph Waldo Emerson, again, I don't know if he said it, but it's a great quote. All great speakers were bad speakers at first. So now let's go back to what we said about talk normal. And by the way, I'm the freak factor guy. So when I tell you to talk normal, that is a big divergence from what I normally talk about, because again, speaking the way, again, not like normal people, not like average people, speaking like you normally speak is one of the best tips. But think about it. When you were a baby, did you speak well? And the answer is no. You stumbled, you did it poorly, you did it badly, and then you got better, then you got better, then you got better, then you got better. And so that's what you have to do with public speaking as well. You have to be willing to practice, and everything's practice. When you're talking to one person in a sales meeting, that's practice. When you're talking to your staff in a staff meeting, that's practice. When you're standing up in front of a room of potential customers, but there's only 6 people in the room, there's practice. There's no situation that doesn't count. Everything counts. And if your goal is to become better, now, one of the things we do with anxiety is we try to avoid the situation that we're anxious about. If you don't like elevators, you try to avoid elevators. If you don't want to drive over bridges, then you don't drive over bridges. You're afraid, and so you avoid it. Well, when you avoid it, that feels really, really good. And so if you avoid public speaking because you're anxious about public speaking, it actually, the psychology of that, I have a master's degree in psychology, an undergraduate degree in psychology. The psychology of that is you actually reinforce that fear, and you make it worse and worse and worse and worse. If you're afraid of flying, every time you don't fly and you drive instead, you make your fear of flying bigger and bigger and bigger, and you reinforce that fear. So if all great speakers were bad speakers at first, and one of the keys to overcoming anxiety and getting better is to practice, then seek out, right? This is called exposure therapy in psychology. Seek out the thing in small ways that you're afraid of and start doing more and more and more and more of it in order to start getting over. Because the reverse is true. Every time you get on a plane, even though you're afraid and the plane doesn't crash, you learn that it's probably going to be fine. And then you get on the next one, you get on the next one. And then if you're somebody like me who's been flying for years and years and years and years and certainly was nervous at first, I don't even think about it. And in fact, I sleep better on planes than I sleep almost anywhere else. My white noise app on my phone is called airplane travel, and it's basically the sound of a jet engine on an airplane. It soothes me and puts me to sleep, right? So the next thing to do is to reframe, right? To reframe this situation, right? One of the things that you do that makes you anxious is you're thinking anxious thoughts. I'm going to fail. I'm not ready. I can't do this. What are people going to think? I'm going to embarrass myself. What if I forget? What if I make a mistake? Right? And you're feeling this anxiety because you're thinking the wrong things. So the first thing I want you to do is focus on the feeling, right? Focus on the feeling. So one of the big things you're doing wrong is you're thinking of your emotions as anxiety. So you say, Dave, I feel anxious. No, you don't. You feel energized. It's your interpretation of the feeling you're having that's making you feel worse. Think about this. You can see the energy that I'm giving you in this presentation right now, even though I'm at home. If I had just been asleep 5 seconds before Allison introduced me, and I was still waking up and I hadn't had any coffee and I was sort of half awake, am I going to be ready to do a presentation? Am I going to be ready to deliver a presentation? And the answer is no. What you're feeling in your body is your body getting you ready to go on stage or get in front of people and do something that's important. What you're feeling is the energy your body's trying to give you to help you be successful on the stage. You don't want to fight the anxiety. You want to ride the energy. And part of the way to do that is to reframe it as energy instead of anxiety. And this is not wishful thinking. This is not rose-colored glasses. This is absolute reality, because if it didn't give you that energy, if it didn't give you that focus, then you wouldn't have what you needed in order to be successful, right? And so then also watch out for things that are going to mess up your energy. So I was talking to somebody recently, and she had a Red Bull in her hand, and she was talking about how nervous she'd just been on stage. And I said, did you have that while you were on stage? Yes. Did you have one before you went on stage? Yes. I said, do you know that caffeine makes you feel really, really nervous and really, really anxious? Because it's giving you what? It's giving you energy, right? She's like, oh, I didn't realize the sensations that I was having was just the caffeine coursing through my veins. And then that piles on top of the energy her body was already trying to give her that she felt was anxiety. And then she felt super anxious, right? But if you're trying to use a Red Bull in order to give you the energy that you need, you're rarely going to call that anxiety. Again, unless you're like, ooh, I had too much and it's making me feel anxious. But again, it's not making you feel anxious. It's giving you sensations that are similar to the feeling of anxiety, but aren't anxiety. It's just your body saying, I think you wanted this. You seem to be trying to do something that really, really matters. The other way to fight the actual negative thoughts, I'm going to fail, this isn't going to go well, people aren't going to like this, I'm not going to succeed, is to practice a mantra. So don't just try to fight it, and don't try to argue with those feelings and those thoughts, and certainly don't try to let them take over. Decide ahead of time that you're going to say something over and over and over to yourself to keep yourself calm, because you can't be thinking two things simultaneously. So if you're thinking, I'm not prepared, then start to say, I am prepared. I'm ready for this. I've practiced. I can do this. If you're saying, I'm ready for this, I've practiced, I can do this, those other things don't get in. And it's those other thoughts that oftentimes cause that anxiety. So pick a mantra, whatever it is for you. This is important. I'm good at this. I've been speaking my whole life. People like the things I talk about. What I'm saying is important. You can pick anything you want. It's going to be personal to you, but it should be something along the lines of, I've done the work that I need to do this well, and I'm ready to be successful. And so that's the other key tip, right? If it's energy, it's not anxiety, then don't think about fighting it. Think about harnessing it. Think about surfing it. Think about using it. Use the anxiety, use the energy that's coming in those chemicals that your body's giving you, and think about how different that is to think about using it instead of fighting it. Instead of saying, I need to stop the butterflies in my stomach, you say, my body's ready. I'm ready to get on stage. I got energy that I need to get out there and do a presentation that's going to be really, really powerful. So harness that anxiety as energy and use it in order to be successful. So persuasive speakers tell powerful stories that reinforce a single idea. So you manage your anxiety. And again, one of the ways you're going to manage your anxiety is, I know what I'm talking about because I'm going to tell stories of things I've experienced. I'm going to tell stories of things that are meaningful to me. I'm going to tell stories about things I understand and that reinforce an idea that's important to me and important to these people. And that's what's going to make this presentation so successful. So the first part of this is to choose one thing, right? Choose a single idea. What's the one thing you want people to understand? What's the one thing that you want them to do at the end of your presentation? And don't do anything else until you've done this. Don't come up with a big outline. Don't come up with a bunch of slides. Don't come up with a bunch of stories. Start with, what's the one thing? What's the most important? You might say, there's 7 things I want them to do. That's not good. What's the, fine, then of the 7, rank them. And what's the one thing of all those things that's the most important thing that you want? And it could be as simple as, I wanted to scan this QR code at the end of this presentation and get an email from me, or get a copy of the slides, or get in our sales funnel, or I want them to schedule a meeting with one of our appointment setters, or I want them to schedule a meeting with me. Or I want them to download this PDF that has this useful information, or I want them to sign up for cybersecurity services, whatever it is, right? What's the one thing you have to do? And then how does everything you do in the entire presentation push towards that single point? So a great example of this is, there was an expedition to the South Pole, and there were two different groups going to be the first to get to the South Pole. And the one group simply wanted to get to the South Pole. So they used dogs, they used skis, and their only goal was to get to the South Pole. They knew that dogs were good in that situation because they were from Norway. They knew that skis were good in that situation. And so they used dogs and they used skis, and they got to the South Pole. And they even did it so well that they left extra stuff there at the South Pole for the other expedition that was really struggling to make it to the South Pole. The other expedition wanted to be the first to the South Pole. They also wanted to do astronomical observations. They also wanted to take a lot of pictures. They also wanted to do some science along the way. They also wanted to try out this new kind of snowmobile kind of concept that they wanted to have. They wanted to do about 15 things. What happened is, they made it to the South Pole. They didn't make it back, and they all died. They were trying to do 7 things and they ended up doing 0 things. The people who wanted to do 1 thing did that 1 thing, and the people who wanted to do a lot of things ended up doing none of those things. She would say, Dave, I got a lot to do. That's great, but it's not going to happen. The more you try to communicate to people in any situation, the more confused they're going to be. One of the biggest things I've done over the course of 20 years of being a professional speaker is try to tell people less and less and less and less. And like I told you, I've done a 2-day training on this one idea that I'm doing for you today, that persuasive speakers tell powerful stories that reinforce a single idea. If you ever saw the movie City Slickers, and it's getting real old now, but there's a great quote in there. He says, you know what the secret to life is? One thing, just one thing. Once you figure it out, you stick to that. Everything else doesn't mean shit, right? What's the one thing, right? And he was telling people in life, and it's a great message in life. What's your one thing? What's the most important thing? What's the thing you're going to try to accomplish? How many times have you ever set New Year's resolutions and you set 7 of them and you get none of them? What's the one thing that really matters? Do you want to lose weight? Do you want to have a better relationship with your spouse? Do you want to build your business? What's the most important thing? And how can you be focused on that one thing? When Twitter first started, and I know it's called X now, but we're talking about Twitter. When Twitter first started, you had 140 characters minimum. They've changed that, but that's a good thing to shoot for, right? This isn't get out a PowerPoint and start typing in really small fonts and be like, okay, my one thing is 7 paragraphs, right? A good thing to shoot for is 140 characters. And again, I'm doing it for you here. Persuasive speakers tell powerful stories that reinforce a single idea. If I was only doing that as an hour-long presentation, I could probably even tighten that up. But even that is a simple sentence, and every single word matters. Every presentation is you trying to persuade somebody, right? You're never improving awareness. Nobody becomes aware of anything that they're not interested in. You have to persuade them to even pay attention to you in the first place. Persuasion, stories, powerful stories that reinforce. How do you keep coming back to that single idea and having everything directed towards that single idea? That's all we're talking about for this whole hour. Persuasive speakers tell powerful stories that reinforce a single idea. If someone in the group is skeptical, I'm sure you're checking right now to see if my one thing is 140 characters. I'm just using that as a general guideline, and I'd love it if you tell me that it's not. That would be fantastic, because it means you're paying attention. So 2 questions to guide you here is, what's your main goal? What's your main goal, and what do you want them to do? And again, sometimes I just want to raise awareness. I just want them to understand about our services. You never just want them to understand your services. You probably want them to sign up for your services. But if there's a step before that, then what is that step? What do you want them to do next? What do you want them to sign up for? And be crystal clear about it. And again, reinforce that. The only thing I want you to do at the end of the day, I'm not trying to sell you anything. I want you to sign up for a 30-minute call with us where we can go over in this cybersecurity checklist. And I'm going to send that to everybody, you know, that signed up for the webinar, whatever it is, right? What's your main goal? What do you want them to do? What's your main goal? What do you want them to do? What I want you to do is become a more persuasive speaker by telling powerful stories that reinforce a single idea. I want you to be more prepared. I want you to practice. I want you to read books about it. I want you to talk normal. Does that make sense? I'm being really, really clear about what I want from you. I want you to tell more stories that stay focused on a single idea. That's going to make you a better presenter, right? So here's a few examples from the work that I do. I have a book called The Freak Factor about how our weaknesses are strengths. And I've given this presentation thousands of times on every continent except Antarctica, which I recently referenced in this presentation. And the simple thought is, what makes us weird also makes us wonderful, and what makes us weak also makes us strong. And I show people the value of weirdness in a world that oftentimes thinks of weirdness as wrongness and weird as bad and normal as good. And then I show people how things that look like weaknesses could also be strengths. So for example, I always got in trouble because I couldn't sit still and be quiet and do what I was told. And now I get paid to stand up and talk and run my own business. It turned out my weaknesses are strengths. And so my whole presentation is designed to help people understand this idea that what makes them weird makes them wonderful, which is why I'm wearing a t-shirt that looks like a tuxedo, is why I'm wearing pink, which is why I have pink glasses, which is why there's weird pink stuff behind me and people give me pink gifts and I wear pink shoes and people draw pink T-Rexes for me, is because what makes us weird also makes us wonderful, and what makes us weak also makes us strong. But I did a presentation, one of my TEDx presentations in Illinois, and it was a different presentation. And my one thing for that is sometimes the opposite of a good thing is a good thing. We think of the opposite of good as bad, the opposite of right is wrong. And my whole presentation was designed to communicate that sometimes the opposite of a good thing is another good thing. And that's a way to differentiate yourself or come up with innovative ideas in your business. When I did my talk, Allison was asking about that, how many views that had. which I think somewhere over 100,000 if you combine them, which is nothing. Obviously, I shouldn't have started with Simon Sinek. Screw that guy, 56 million. But when I started preparing for that talk, they said, Dave, normally TED Talks are 18 minutes, but because this is our 10th anniversary, you see the 10 behind me here, because this is our 10th anniversary, we're going to give you 10 minutes. That really required me to focus, and it really helped me because instead of trying to squish my 1 hour, 1.5 hour presentation into 10 minutes somehow, and somehow try to cover all the different sections, still focused on a single idea, but trying to fit in a lot of different sections, I realized I could only use one section. I could only use one module, which is something I'm going to teach you in a second. I could only use one module. And so I narrowed everything down to that in the right situation, our weaknesses become strengths. In my presentation, it's the alignment module. It's a section where I talk about the importance of finding the right fit instead of trying to fit in. And I realized that the general single idea, what makes us weird, makes us wonderful, what makes us weak, makes us strong, was too broad. And so I narrowed it down and I clarified it. And in that excerpt presentation, I said 7 or 8 times in the right situation, our weaknesses became strengths. And then I told stories and gave examples and used quotes and asked questions that led people back to seeing and believing that in the right situation, something even like a disability that looks like a weakness can become a strength when they're in the right situation. It proved the value of alignment and the importance of alignment, changing where we are, not changing who we are. When I speak to teachers, I change it again. And this is important. Notice I'm using almost the same presentation. I'm giving you different examples, but then I narrow it even further for specific groups. So when I talk to teachers and educators, I tell a few special stories about how someone's life was changed in a moment when someone saw strength where everyone else saw weakness. So I give mostly the same presentation, use a couple of other small story modules, and change it to we transform lives when we find strength where everyone else sees weakness, right? I've done Better Your Best coaching for the speakers that are in the contest to become the spokesperson for TMT. I've done that for a few years now. And here's some of the examples from things people have used on stage. Consistent success comes from consistent, healthy action. And Ross Brouse gave a presentation that reinforced this concept that consistent success comes from consistent, healthy action. And everything came back to this main point. The first winner that I coached was Mike Bazar, whose presentation, his main idea was that 1 in a row is a success. And he kept showing things that people could do and then things they should do to follow up to create this idea that 1 in a row is a success. And now if you're saying, hey, Dave, 1 in a row is a success, doesn't make sense because you can't make a row with 1. That's part of what makes this interesting. And you can learn from this example. Sometimes the opposite of a good thing is a good thing is a little bit counterintuitive. What makes us weird makes us wonderful, makes us weak, also makes us strong is a little bit counterintuitive. 1 in a row of success is a little counterintuitive. That gets people's attention, and now they're paying attention to you and they want to hear you explain and persuade. Persuasive speakers tell powerful stories that reinforce a single idea. Persuade them that 1 in a row is a success, right? I did a compliance presentation for TMT that people can use as a webinar. And the main idea that I used there was cybersecurity doesn't have to be complex and confusing. Just treat your computer the same way you treat your dream car. It was designed to teach people who aren't computer and cybersecurity experts that they already understand cybersecurity. It's just the same way they manage security and insurance and compliance for their vehicle. And it made it simple and easy to understand for people who don't normally understand that by comparing it to something else. If we had more time, if we were doing more than an hour, we'd talk about the value of analogies. But the main point here is this was a single idea that brought together a lot of valuable information for a non-computer expert to be able to understand what you're trying to sell them. So they're not suspicious and defensive. They're like, oh yeah, I have insurance for my car, so of course I'd get a cyber insurance. Oh yeah, I have registration and a driver's license and a license plate, and I pay my property taxes on my car before I can even drive it off the lot. So of course I would care about compliance with cybersecurity. It's obvious because we made this connection, but we focused on that one thing, right? So persuasive speakers tell powerful stories that reinforce a single idea. So what you want to do is you want to build modules, and these modules are going to be these independent sections that reinforce that single idea, right? We're going back, we're reinforcing that single idea. You're going to build these modules that all revolve around. And so the reason the modules are important is because if someone says you got 5 minutes, you just use one module. You got 10 minutes, you use 2 modules. You got 20, 30 minutes, I got to use 3 modules. Because everything reinforces that single idea, just like I did with TEDx Zurich, I just picked the alignment module. Once you have these self-contained modules, you don't have a big long presentation. You have units that you can put in and take out in order to be effective in any time frame and in any particular setting. Maybe one wouldn't work well for a webinar. Maybe one wouldn't work well for a live presentation. Maybe one wouldn't work well for that particular audience. Maybe one would be better. Maybe you don't have enough time. When you build these modules, it's going to help you manage your presentation because you can move things in and move things out quickly in your unit. So the way to do this is to understand the way that a 2-year-old works. And the way that a 2-year-old works, the most important question, the most common question that a 2-year-old has is why, right? 2-year-olds love to ask why. And this is important because everyone else still wants to know why, but they don't ask because at some point in their life, adults stopped telling them why, and they told them to stop asking why, and they learned that people don't like to answer the question why. But remember in the beginning, we talked about Simon Sinek and the power of why. We talked about the drone company and the power of understanding why they're making drones. The number one question people have for you in your presentation, whatever you want them to do, whatever your one thing is, the number one question they have is, why should I do that? And the answer to that is because, right? So every one of your modules is, I want you to do this one thing. Why? Because, and then you create a module around it. Because, and then you create a module around it. Because, and then you create a module around it. So now notice you're talking about more than one thing, but it's all in the reinforcement of and the repetition of that one thing that you want them to focus on. So the most powerful things that you can say in a presentation is, I want you to do this because, for example, and think about how many times I've done this, manage your anxiety this way because, for example, right? Tell stories because, for example, what's this going to be worth? This is going to be worth a lot. Why? Because, for example, over and over and over again, I've used that without always using those exact terms. Stories are examples. So if you even think I don't have a lot of stories, you do. You have examples of a client that benefited from your services, a client who could have benefited from your services, but they didn't take them on. And then they had a problem with cybersecurity because they didn't take on your services. Examples are stories as well. So you're going to use 4 things in each of your modules. The first one is questions. We've done this a bunch of times. I started every college course that I ever taught as a professor with a question. Pretty early on today, I asked you a question. What's it worth to get better at presentations? Ask people questions in each one of your modules. Ask them simple questions that could be answered with a raise of the hand or a yes or a nod of the head. What I like to do in live presentations is raise my hand so people know how to respond and just say, how many of you, right? So if we were live, I could have said, how many of you have ever done a presentation? How many of you think that it would be valuable that it would help you make more money to give a better presentation? How many of you get nervous for presentations? Simple yes or no. People can raise their hand because what you're trying to do is you're trying to get people to opt into whatever you're talking about. The people making those drones cared about the military members in the Middle East that they were serving, but they didn't know about it until he reminds them about the importance, and he makes that link directly, connects it, right? So remind people with questions that what you're talking about is relevant to them and useful to them, and have them sign up and go, yep, that's me. I want to learn more about this because this is important to me. So questions are a key part of every module. The next one is quotes. Use other people's credibility. We did it earlier. All the great speakers were bad speakers at first. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Don't listen to me. Listen to somebody else more famous and successful than me, and you know who the people are in your industry. You know who the people are out in the general public that people are going to pay attention to. Use quotes from people who have credibility or quotes that are just really, really important that support what you're trying to talk about. The way you reinforce that single idea is with questions and with quotes. The next one is with statistics, right? This one says reading comprehension increases by 70% when color is used in visuals. Okay? So instead of saying, hey, it's really important to use color, and I really like to use color, and color is really valuable, somebody's going to be skeptical and say, I don't know if that's true. And then you say, in a recent study, they discovered that reading comprehension increases by 70% when color is used in visuals. So questions, quotes, statistics, these are going to be in each module. And this can all be really fast. We just did it, right? How many of you have ever done a bad presentation? You go, oh yeah. And then I go, all great speakers were bad speakers at first. And one thing that great speakers do is they use color in their visuals. A recent study showed that reading comprehension increases by 70% when color is used in visuals. In 25 seconds, I just did a question, a quote, and a statistic. Just boom, like that in 20 something seconds. This is how the modules can work to reinforce what it is that you're talking about. And then the last part, and we've talked about this a bunch, is stories, right? The crucial, the backbone. Leave out quotes if you want. Leave out statistics if you want. Leave out questions if you want. Persuasive speakers tell powerful stories that reinforce. The way you reinforce is with quotes, questions, and statistics, but the backbone, the spine, the core of every presentation is stories and examples that illustrate what it is that you're trying to explain to people. So remember, everything's focused on that single thing, that one thing that you want them to do, which is why you can't start your preparation or your practice without knowing what that one thing is. So here's a visual that might help with that, right? You got your one idea in the middle, and then you got module 1 with a story, with a statistic, with a question, with a quote. Then you got module 2, right? That might answer a different question or give a different illustration or explain a different part of the problem or a different part of the solution. But you just keep building these modules with stories, statistics, questions, and quotes. It's a statistic from the FBI. It's a question that gets people to realize this is a problem for all businesses. It's a quote from a famous person in your field or in your industry or somebody who had a meaningful impact in your life. And when you build these modules, because you notice they're units by themselves and they reinforce that idea. If they shorten your presentation or they make your presentation longer or they adjust your presentation or whatever, you can adjust your presentation easily by just simply moving out. What I did was I threw away every module except one for my TEDx Zurich talk, and I had my one idea. I changed it a little bit and I used one module to reinforce it, and that was it, right? I could be flexible because I knew you can change it all. You can have modules that you just use in your webinar. Your one idea doesn't change though. You're in person, you still have your one idea. Your modules might be a little different because you can do some things that you couldn't do online as well, right? But this is a great outline to use, and a great way to fill in the blanks on what should be in your good presentation is I need a good question to get people to buy in. I need a good quote to support what I'm saying. I need a good statistic. I need a good story. I need a good example. This can help fill in the content. And notice there's no bullet points in here. There's no lists in here. None of that is crucial for what we're talking about here. This will help you because now you're searching for that piece that fits in this spot that illustrates this key thing that you're trying to do to support that single idea. So what I want to do now is I want to actually show you a module from one of my presentations, right? And so I have a module called Appreciation. And the idea is that to show that it's a wonderful thing that we have weaknesses because those weaknesses are also strengths. And instead of just accepting that, we should appreciate it. So I start with a quote. Every limit is a beginning as well as an ending. And so I want to tell you about the beginnings that come with the limits that we have, right? And one of the limits that we have is dyslexia. When you have dyslexia, you struggle to read and you struggle to write, which means you're going to struggle in school. And we've all been taught that if you struggle in school, you'll struggle in life. And that's why they were really surprised when they were studying millionaires in the United Kingdom and discovered that 50% of the millionaires in their study had dyslexia, even though only 25%, or even though only 10% of people in the general population have dyslexia. They were studying entrepreneurs in the United States and discovered that 35% of the entrepreneurs in their study had dyslexia, even though only 10% of people in the general population have dyslexia. So let's stop for a second, right? In about a minute, I've just shared with you a quote that reinforces my main idea. Then I've told you about a weakness that's a diagnosable disability, dyslexia, and how two different studies, so I've given you two different statistics, showed that 50% of millionaires in one study, 35% of entrepreneurs in another study have dyslexia. So you're starting to see, wait a second, this thing that looks like a weakness is also a strength. So quote, right? Now, one thing I could use there, and I'll use a question at the end, but one way I could start that off is how many of you know somebody who has dyslexia? You have a family member or a friend that has dyslexia. Almost every hand is going to go up in the room because so many people have dyslexia, right? And now people are opting into what you're talking about. So now I keep going and notice how short these examples are, these stories are. Ingvar Kamprad is the billionaire founder of IKEA, and he has dyslexia. Basically one long sentence. Notice how short a story can be. I'm going to tell you the story of this guy here has dyslexia and became the billionaire founder of one of the world's largest and most successful furniture companies. Now, we're not going to talk a lot about visuals today, but there's another thing I'd encourage you to pay attention to. And if you do the replay of this, pay attention again. Notice I just put him up there. I don't put Ingvar Kamprad was the billionaire founder of IKEA. He had dyslexia and make you read all that. A picture's worth 1,000 words. And when I put this up here, you know I'm talking about IKEA, and you know I'm talking about some old guy who had dyslexia who probably was running the place. But then we keep going. Richard Branson is the billionaire founder of the Virgin series of companies. And I know that some of you might be thinking, right, I'm trying to reinforce that idea. I'm trying to persuade you. And I know that some of you don't want to be persuaded. So you're like, well, maybe they overcame their dyslexia. But they asked Richard Branson, how has dyslexia affected your success? And he said, strangely, I think my dyslexia has helped. In other words, he didn't succeed in spite of his dyslexia. He succeeded because of his dyslexia. And scientists are starting to realize that he's right, that people with dyslexia don't have broken brains, they have different brains, and the same brain that causes them to struggle in school causes them to succeed in life at a higher level than most of the rest of the people ever will. This guy's name is Paul Orfila. He had dyslexia and ADHD, so he got kicked out of 4 schools, would get fired from jobs on the first day, and even got fired by his own father from a family-owned business. And then he went on to start his own company. He called it Kinko's, and he sold it to FedEx for $2.4 billion. And he said this, he said, I think everyone should have dyslexia. He appreciates his weakness so much because he knows it is strength. He appreciates his dyslexia because it knows what makes him unique. His ADHD gives him the energy that he needs and the interactions that he needs to make him successful. He appreciates who he is because he understands how the weakness and the strength are connected. What makes us weird also makes us wonderful, and what makes us weak also makes us strong. Paul Orfila feels more wonderful because of how weird he is. He feels stronger because of his weaknesses. So notice I used quotes, questions, stories, and statistics to reinforce this idea that what makes us weird also makes us wonderful, and what makes us weak also makes us strong, but also one specific piece of that, which is appreciation. And then you notice I'm going to keep repeating that same thing, just like I've done in this presentation. One of the ways to reinforce is simply through repetition. But you can't repeat it if you don't know what your main idea is. You can't repeat things if you're constantly telling people new things. You have to have that one thing and find a way to clarify it in a way that allows you to say it over and over again, even in slightly different ways. And we don't have time for that today. But repeat it in a way that reminds people. Also, repetition is a way to tell people that something's important. If I stop and say, let me say that again, because I want to make sure you heard it, and I repeat something, you're going to pay attention in a different way because repetition tells people this is important and this really matters. So persuasive speakers tell powerful stories that reinforce through modules, through stories, through questions, through statistics, a single idea, right? And think about what happens with concrete. If you want concrete to be really, really strong and almost unbreakable, you reinforce it with steel. You're not making it not concrete. You're not making something different. You're making the concrete stronger. You're making the building stronger by reinforcing. That's what you're trying to do by using modules, quotes, questions, stories, and statistics. You're reinforcing that idea. So the last thing I want to talk to you about today is how to reinforce that with frameworks, right? So just look at the top part of this. When I give my Freak Factor presentation, I say that we're going to change our beliefs and then we're going to change our behaviors. Part 1 is changing beliefs. Part 2 is changing behaviors. And I don't show this whole thing. I'm just using this to show you. And I have a module on awakening to see that everything we've learned about weakness is wrong. I have a module on assessment and understanding ourselves. I have a module on acceptance. I just showed you the module on appreciation. Then I moved to a module about turning up the volume on who you are. I moved to a module on aligning, which I told you about before, that I used for my TEDx talk. And I do a module about finding the right fit instead of trying to fit in. Then I do a module about staying away from things that don't fit you and moving towards things that do, alignment and avoid, align and avoid. And then the last one is affiliation, partner with people who are strong where we're weak. I have an outline, I have a structure, I have a framework, and I communicate that to people during the presentation. My reinforcement of that single idea has a structure that reinforces what I'm trying to talk about, but you can't reinforce it if you don't know. My first book was called The 4 Factors of Effective Leadership. Factor 1 is influence, made up of self-discipline and influence. Factor 2 is integrity, made up of credibility and trust. Factor 3 is inspiration, made up of personal mission and shared vision. Factor 4 is improvement, personal growth, and developing others. And what I teach people in the book and in the talk is that we start with internal success and we move out to interpersonal success. So the shape and the outline communicates the idea. Amplification was the other one. You see that movement like you would move up the dial on something, right? So the way you reinforce your single idea is oftentimes by creating a structure, and you've done this before, point 1, point 2, point 3, but sometimes you can make the framework even more clear and give it a structure, give it an order. You start here, you move here, you start here, you build on this, and that's one of the other ways that you reinforce that single idea. Here's an example that we use for Pink Goldfish, which is a book about marketing and strategy, and we created an acronym called FLOSSOM, and that becomes the framework for the presentation. You saw the cybersecurity presentation before. We had 4 main points to that. And throughout the presentation, we did point number 1. You want somebody who's competent and trustworthy. Then you want them to have experience and expertise in cybersecurity. Then you want a good cyber insurance policy. Then you want compliance. So there was 4 main parts of the presentation, all coming back to the main point of the presentation. You want to create a framework. You want to create a structure. Right? So we don't have time today for designing visuals. And again, that's a great point. You did not, the presentation doesn't fall apart because we can't cover everything in one moment. And I wasn't even intending to get there. I was seeing if maybe we could get there. The only thing I needed you to know was the thing I said in the first 5 seconds. Persuasive speakers tell powerful stories that reinforce a single idea. Even if they take away all of my time, I can tell you what I want to tell you in about 15 seconds. And then everything else is just bonus time as I reinforce that single idea. So persuasive speakers tell powerful stories that reinforce a single idea. Whether you're in a webinar, whether you're live, whether you're in a small group or a large group, persuasive speakers tell powerful stories that reinforce a single idea. So thanks for spending a little bit of your afternoon with me. Allison, thanks for having me on. I gave it my all. I got sweaty. I got worked up. I waved my arms. I might have even hit the ceiling. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully it was beneficial. Persuasive speakers tell powerful stories that reinforce a single idea. Thanks a lot, Allison.
Amazing stuff, Dave. Yeah, go ahead and put in the comments, if you enjoyed this session, what you got out of it. You're going to hate me for doing this, Dave, but I found our picture. You might want to shield your eyes.
Oh, yeah. That is a lot of leg.
Yeah, that's a lot of thigh on a
See
big
on
guy.
Zoom, folks, I'm 6'6", so that's a lot of leg. That's a lot of leg right there.
Oh, that was fun. No, thank you so much,
One of us is
Dave.
looking better, and it's you, Allison. One of us is looking better, and it's
you're
you.
looking pretty good there too. You're looking pretty
Oh, it's
good.
the same shirt too. We're keeping it consistent. Look at that.
There you go. There you go. So no, but in all seriousness, amazing. I mean, you should see the comments coming in here, Dave. Super Dave, amazing. Thank you. I got to rewatch. Fantastic presentation. Awesome presentation. Thank you. Great job. So thank you so much.
Let me say too, remember, if you do rewatch and remember, pay attention to what I'm doing, not just what I'm saying, because I'm also doing, right? You can't, if you give a bad presentation about giving presentations, then it obviously misses the point, right? And if I tell you to do something and I'm not doing it during my presentation, then you're like, where's this coming from? So again, we didn't get to visuals, for example. So watch the visuals and realize there was never a bunch of bullet points. There was never a big long list. There was never a ton of words. There was tons of pictures. We talked about that a little bit, but pay attention. I used quotes, and oftentimes I stopped and said that, but again, just watch the presentation And you can learn just from watching it and paying attention to how it's being done, not just what's being said.
Yeah, amazing. I'm also putting right now, I just put it in there. You've got a new podcast.
The
So
Imperfectionist podcast, it's on Spotify, it's on YouTube, it's on Apple. The Imperfectionist podcast with David Rendall, Rendall. I'd love it if you want to join us and find out more about how weaknesses might be strengths.
yeah, awesome. Okay, Dave, as always, thank you so much. Appreciate you. I've even got a page full of notes, and I've seen this presentation, I don't know, 4 or 5 times, but thank you so much. Everybody on here, amazing feedback. So
Thank you. Bye-bye.
happy 4th.